My life basically ran on two things: caffeine and anxiety. As a 20-year-old sophomore at a state university in Austin, that felt pretty standard. I was juggling a full course load in computer science and working what felt like 1,000,000 hours a week as a barista. My days started before sunrise with the hiss of the espresso machine and ended long after midnight with the glow of a laptop screen, my brain swimming with code I barely understood. My diet consisted mostly of instant ramen, the 25-cent kind, and whatever leftover pastries I was allowed to take home from my job. My student loan portal was a source of constant, low-grade panic. Every time I logged in, the numbers seemed to have grown, a monstrous digital beast feeding on my future. I worked 30 hours a week, sometimes more, but it felt like I was just bailing out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. Every dollar was accounted for: rent for my cramped off-campus apartment, utilities, a textbook that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, gas for my beat-up 2004 sedan that made a worrying sound every time I turned left. Then there were my parents, David and Sarah. They lived about a 40-minute drive away in a quiet, manicured suburb where every lawn was perfectly green and every house looked like it was staged for a magazine photo shoot. Their home was pristine. You could walk in at any time on any day and it would be spotless, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and potpourri. It was a world away from my own chaotic existence. Our relationship was decent, I guess. We weren't a bit totally. The conversation would inevitably drift to my finances, especially if I ever made the mistake of sounding tired. "You just need to learn how to budget, son," my dad David would say in his calm, authoritative voice. "When I was your age, I worked 2 jobs and still saved money. It's about discipline." My mom, Sarah, would chime in with, "Maybe you could pick up a few more shifts at the coffee shop. Every little bit helps." They'd say this while sitting in their comfortable living room with its plush new sofas and a 70-inch flat-screen TV on the wall. They never offered to help, not once. I remember one desperate month where my car needed a new alternator, a surprise $600 bill that completely wiped me out. I hinted at it on the phone, mentioning I was eating rice for every meal to make rent. Their advice was to look into starting a side hustle. I ended up selling my old guitar, the one I'd saved for a year to buy in high school. The silence from them on the matter was deafening. I just assumed they were proud, maybe a little old-fashioned, believing their son needed to build character by struggling. I loved them, but a part of me resented that they couldn't see how close to the edge I really was. So when the invitation for Thanksgiving dinner came, I felt a familiar mix of obligation and exhaustion. The thought of driving down there, putting on a happy face, and listening to lectures about work ethic was draining. But there was one bright spot. My grandma, Evelyn, was flying in from her retirement community in Florida. Grandma Evelyn was a force of nature. Even in her late 70s, she had more energy than most people I knew. She was sharp, funny, and had a way of cutting through a conversation to get to the heart of things. She wasn't afraid to call people out, but she did it with a twinkle in her eye that made it impossible to be mad at her. I hadn't seen her in over a year, and the thought of her warm hug and no-nonsense attitude was the only thing making me look forward to the holiday. The day came, and I put on my one nice shirt, a button-down that was slightly frayed at the cuffs, and drove to my parents' house. The moment I pulled into their driveway, the contrast hit me like a physical blow. My sputtering, dented car looked like a piece of junk next to their 2 shiny, late-model SUVs in the garage. Inside, the house was immaculate. The air was thick with the scent of roasting turkey and sage. A perfect golden-brown bird was resting on the counter. The dining table was set with the good china and polished silverware that only came out for special occasions. My dad was watching football, and my mom was bustling around the kitchen, her movements precise and controlled. The first hour was a blur of forced pleasantries. The drive was fine. Classes are challenging but good. Yes, I'm getting enough sleep. It was all surface level, the same polite dance we always did. Then, Grandma Evelyn arrived. She swept into the house in a cloud of lavender perfume, wrapping me in a tight hug that smelled like home and peppermints. "Alex, look at you. You're all skin and bones. Are they not feeding you in that city?" she said, loud enough for my parents to hear. I just laughed, feeling a genuine smile spread across my face for the first time all day. We all sat down to dinner. The food was, as always, incredible. My mom was a fantastic cook, but the tension was still there, a low hum beneath the clinking of forks and knives. My dad talked about his golf game. My mom talked about her book club. They asked me again if I was budgeting my money from the coffee shop. I just nodded and shoveled mashed potatoes into my mouth, trying to avoid the conversation. Finally, after the main course was cleared and my mom brought out the pumpkin pie, the moment arrived. There was a brief, comfortable silence as everyone took their first bite of dessert. Grandma Evelyn, sitting across from me, put her fork down and smiled warmly. Her eyes were bright and kind. "So, Alex," she began, her voice cheerful and clear in the quiet room, "I've been meaning to ask, is the $1,500 I send you every month enough to help with school? I know Austin's getting expensive." I set my own fork down, a confused little laugh escaping my lips. I must have misheard her. "I'm sorry, Grandma. What was that?" She smiled, patient. "The money, $1,500 a month. I set up the transfers to start the day you moved into your dorm. Is it helping you keep your head above water?" The air in the room seemed to crystallize. The background hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded like a jet engine. I stared at her, my mind a complete and utter blank. I thought maybe it was a joke, or maybe, as my parents had sometimes hinted, she was getting a little forgetful. I tried for a light tone. "Grandma, what are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What money?" Silence. It was a heavy, suffocating thing that pressed down on all of us. I saw the cheerful confusion on my grandma's face begin to curdle into real concern. And then, as if pulled by an invisible string, my gaze drifted from hers. My eyes, and then my grandma's, landed on my parents. It was like watching a photograph develop in reverse. The color drained from their faces, leaving behind a waxy gray pallor. My mom's hand was frozen halfway to her mouth, a small piece of pie still on her fork. My dad's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching in his cheek. They weren't looking at me. They weren't looking at my grandma. They were staring at their plates as if the floral pattern held the answers to the universe. They looked like two people who had just seen a ghost. And in that awful, deafening silence, I had a sudden, terrifying realization that the ghost was me. The silence that followed my question, "What money?" wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a physical thing. It was a heavy blanket that smothered the cheerful Thanksgiving atmosphere, snuffing out the scent of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie. The air grew thick, and I felt like I was breathing jello. My gaze, along with everyone else's, was locked on my parents. My mom, Sarah, had a smile frozen on her face, a grotesque mask of pleasantness that didn't reach her eyes. My dad, David, just stared at his plate, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. They had both gone a shade of white I'd only ever seen on chalkboards. "David? Sarah?" Grandma Evelyn's voice was calm, but it sliced through the tension like a razor. "What's going on? Alex doesn't know about the money?" My dad finally moved. He set his fork down with a loud clatter that made me jump. He cleared his throat and looked around the table, forcing a strained laugh. "Evelyn, really, this isn't the time or place for financial discussions. We're having a family dinner. It's a misunderstanding, that's all." My mom chimed in, her voice an octave too high. She patted my arm, but her touch felt like ice. "Your grandma and we have an arrangement for you. It's all taken care of. You don't need to worry your head about it. But Grandma Evelyn is not the kind of person you can just pat on the arm and dismiss. She's retired, but her mind is as sharp as a tack. She'd spent 40 years as a head accountant for a major corporation. She notices when the numbers don't add up. She looked from my mom to my dad, her expression unreadable. "There's no misunderstanding, Sarah," she said, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone that commanded the room. "I've been depositing $1,500 into the joint account you two set up for him on the first of every month since he started college at UT Austin. That's 24 months. She paused, letting the numbers hang in the air. "Where is the $36,000, Sarah?" $36,000. The figure hit me like a splash of ice water. 36 grand. That was more than a year's tuition. That was a new laptop and a decent used car. That was the difference between scraping by on instant ramen and actually being able to focus on my studies. My head swam. I looked at my parents, my heart thudding against my ribs, begging them to have a good explanation. The rest of the dinner was a blur of mumbled excuses and hasty exits. My parents quickly declared it was getting late and practically bundled my grandma and me out the door. The drive back to my tiny off-campus apartment was suffocatingly quiet. The gaslighting started the next day. It was my mom who called first. Her voice was syrupy sweet, full of manufactured concern. "Honey, about last night. Your dad and I were just so embarrassed. We were planning on surprising you. The first lie. We've been putting that money from your grandmother into a special high-yield investment account. It's for after you graduate. A little nest egg so you can start your life without worrying." It almost sounded plausible. Almost. "Then why didn't you just say that?" I asked, my voice flat. "Oh honey, you know your dad. He's so proud. He wanted it to be a big surprise. And you know," her voice dropped conspiratorially, "your grandma, she's getting older. Sometimes she gets a little confused about the details." That night, my dad tried a different approach. He was all bluster and paternal authority. "You really put your mother and me in a tough spot, Alex. Airing private family business like that. We're holding the money for you. It's safer with us. You're young, you'd probably just spend it on nonsense." Over the next few days, the lies kept shifting. One day it was an investment. The next it was a savings account. The day after that it was a misunderstanding. And maybe Grandma hadn't even been sending the money consistently. They were trying to drive a wedge between me and my grandmother, painting her as a senile old woman and me as an ungrateful kid. But a seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing into a thorny vine of suspicion. I thought back. I remembered the time my laptop died right before midterms last year. I'd called them, desperate, practically begging for a few $100s to get it fixed. "We're sorry, Alex," my dad had said, his voice full of phony regret. "Things are just really tight right now. You'll have to figure it out. It builds character." I ended up working 30 hours of overtime at the coffee shop that week, fueled by caffeine and panic, just to afford a cheap replacement. I remembered my car breaking down on the side of I-35. The repair was over $500. They told me to budget better. I had to borrow money from my roommate, a debt that hung over my head for months. I lived on 25-cent ramen packets for what felt like an eternity, losing weight and sleep, while they lectured me on the phone about fiscal responsibility from their pristine 5-bedroom house in the suburbs. The final piece I needed clicked into place on a cold Tuesday afternoon. My hands were shaking as I dialed my bank's customer service number. After 5 minutes of hold music that grated on my raw nerves, a polite woman answered. I explained the situation, asking if there had ever been a joint account opened in my name with David and Sarah. "Let me check for you, sir," she said. I could hear her typing. The silence stretched on. "No, Mr. Thompson. I see your standard student checking and savings accounts, but there's no record of a joint account with those names ever being associated with your profile." "Are you sure?" I asked, a wave of nausea washing over me. "Could it have been closed?" "No, sir. There's no record of it ever having existed here." The fog of confusion finally burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard pit of certainty in my stomach. The excuses, the lectures, the feigned poverty, it was all a lie. A massive, intricate, 2-year-long lie. That weekend, I had to drop off a textbook I'd borrowed from my dad. The house was quiet when I let myself in. My mom was out shopping. My dad was in the backyard, raking leaves. A terrible idea, a reckless impulse, took hold of me. I walked down the hall and quietly pushed open the door to his home office. The room was immaculate, just like the rest of the house. A large mahogany desk sat facing the window. Driven by a desperate need for proof, I pulled open the top drawer. Pens, paper clips, a staple remover, Nothing. Then I tried the deep file drawer on the bottom. Tucked away at the very back, underneath a file labeled Taxes 2018, was a thick stack of envelopes held together with a rubber band. They were all addressed to my parents, and on each one, in stark red print, were words that made my blood run cold. Final notice. Urgent, immediate action required. Accounts past due. My fingers trembled as I reached for them, but just as I touched the paper, a shadow fell over me. "What do you think you're doing?" I whipped around. My dad stood in the doorway, his face a thundercloud. His usual calm suburban dad demeanor was gone, replaced by a raw, feral anger I had never seen before. I was just," I stammered, dropping the file. "You were just what? Snooping?" He strode into the room and snatched the letters from the drawer, shoving them behind his back like a child hiding a stolen cookie. "This is my private office, Alex. My private papers. After everything we do for you, this is the thanks we get? You go behind our backs and rifle through our things?" His hypocrisy was breathtaking. He was yelling at me for a breach of trust, while I was standing in the very room where the evidence of his massive, life-altering betrayal was hidden. The rage in his eyes wasn't just about me being in his office. It was the frantic, cornered rage of someone whose carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. In that moment, looking at his furious, guilty face, I knew. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a poorly planned surprise. They weren't protecting my money. They were stealing it. The air in my parents' living room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. For 3 days, we'd been living in a cold war of silent meals and avoided eye contact. My dad, David, would bury his face in the newspaper, his jaw clenched tight. My mom, Sarah, would nervously clean things that were already spotless, her hands trembling just slightly. They were waiting for the storm to pass, hoping I'd just forget. Hoping I'd swallow their flimsy excuses about investing and misunderstandings. But I wasn't a kid anymore. The sickening certainty that had replaced my shock was a cold, hard stone in my gut, and I was about to throw it right through the glass house they had so carefully constructed. I had asked them to sit down with me on Sunday evening. "We need to talk," I'd said, my voice eerily calm. They'd exchanged a quick, panicked look, but agreed. Now they sat together on their plush beige sofa, looking like they were waiting for a verdict. I sat opposite them in my dad's leather armchair, my laptop open on the coffee table between us. On the screen, framed by the bright, sunny window of her Florida condo, was my grandma, Evelyn. Her expression was patient but firm, her eyes missing nothing. "Okay," I began, taking a deep breath to steady myself. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I don't want to fight. I just want to understand. So I'm going to lay out what I know, and you can tell me where I'm wrong." My dad started to speak, a placating, patronizing tone already in his voice. "Alex, son, we already told you, your grandmother is a little—" "Don't." Grandma Evelyn's voice cut through the speaker, sharp and clear as a bell. "Don't you dare finish that sentence, David. Let the boy speak." My dad's mouth snapped shut. My mom flinched as if she'd been struck. I clicked a few keys on my laptop and turned the screen toward them. "This is a statement from Grandma's bank," I said, my voice flat. "It shows a recurring transfer of $1,500 initiated 24 months ago on the 1st of the month every month. The destination account is a joint savings account. Account number ends in 4582. You told me you set it up for me when I started college." I slid a folder across the coffee table. Inside were my own printed bank statements from the last 2 years. These are my statements, from my checking and my savings. As you can see, there have been no incoming transfers from that joint account. Ever. A strangled little sound escaped my mom's throat. My dad just stared at the papers, his face turning a blotchy red. "That's $36,000, I continued, the calmness in my voice starting to fray at the edges. "So my first question is, where is it? And please, don't tell me it's in a high-yield savings account you set up for me." I called the bank. The joint account exists, but the money was transferred out of it within 24 hours of every single one of Grandma's deposits. Every time. Silence. It was a suffocating, damning silence. My dad wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the oriental rug like it held the answers to the universe. The dam inside me finally began to crack. The cold factual presentation was over. Now it was personal. Remember freshman year? My voice shook. When my laptop fried itself a week before midterms, I called you, desperate. I told you I'd be kicked out of my programming class if I couldn't turn in the final project. You told me money was tight and that I should check the library's hours. I looked at my mom, whose eyes were now swimming with tears. You told me to be more responsible with my things. I worked 30 hours a week for a month at the coffee shop, double shifts, just to afford a used one. I practically lived on stale bagels and free coffee refills. The memories were coming back in a hot, painful rush. Remember when I needed that new set of textbooks for organic chemistry? $400. You said you just couldn't swing it. You suggested I find a friend and photocopy the pages. I lived on ramen noodles for 2 months, actual ramen, not the fancy kind, the 25-cent packs, to save up for them, all while you were going out to dinner and redecorating the guest bathroom. I finally looked straight at my dad. I found this in your office. I pulled out one of the letters I'd found. It was from a financial institution marked Final Notice in stark red letters. He looked up, his eyes wide with a mix of fury and pure terror. I didn't open it. I don't need to. I get it now. All the secrecy, the "we're just being careful" speeches. I leaned forward, my hands clenched into fists on my knees. I don't want excuses anymore. I don't want lies. I've had a lifetime of you telling me to work harder, to be smarter with my money, to pull myself up by my bootstraps. I want the truth, right now. That's when it all came crashing down. My dad, the man who always had an answer, the man who prided himself on his stoicism and control, just broke. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, and a sound I'd never heard from him before, a dry, gut-wrenching sob, filled the room. My mom started talking, her words spilling out in a frantic, weeping mess. It was a real estate venture. About 3 years ago, she cried, twisting a tissue in her hands. Your father's friend. It seemed like a sure thing, a guaranteed return. We put in almost all of our savings. My dad looked up, his face pale and ravaged. It wasn't a sure thing, he whispered, his voice hoarse. It was a disaster. We lost everything. We've been living on credit cards ever since. Just trying to keep our heads above water, trying to keep the house. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The pristine house, the new SUV in the driveway, the advice about budgeting. It was all a facade. A desperate, pathetic lie they were living every single day. The money from Grandma, my money, wasn't funding a secret life of luxury. It was patching the massive, sinking hole in their financial boat. It was keeping the foreclosure notices from turning into an eviction crew on their manicured lawn. A wave of something hot and bitter washed over me. It was more than anger. It was a profound, soul-deep hurt. I stood up, looking down at my 2 broken parents. So you watched me, I said, my voice low and trembling with rage and betrayal. You watched me drown in student debt. You watched me work myself to exhaustion for chump change. You watched me stress about rent and count every single dollar for groceries. You heard me on the phone, desperate and scared, and you told me to try harder. All while you were cashing checks that were meant for me. You let me believe I was alone in my struggle, while you stole from your own son just to keep up appearances. The confession hung in the air of my parents' perfect dining room, thick and suffocating. The scent of roasted turkey and rosemary was gone, replaced by something that tasted like ash in the back of my throat. The words, "a disastrous business deal," and "we lost everything," echoed in the terrible silence. My father, a man I'd only ever seen as a pillar of suburban strength, was slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. My mother sat ramrod straight, her skin the color of skim milk, her eyes fixed on the pristine white tablecloth as if searching for an escape hatch. I thought this moment would feel like a victory. I had imagined righteous anger, a powerful surge of vindication. But looking at the shattered shells of my parents, all I felt was a deep, hollow ache. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, a disaster you saw coming but were powerless to stop. The people who had lectured me about budgeting while they stole from me weren't villains from a movie. They were just pathetic, broken. Then Grandma Evelyn spoke. Throughout their entire rambling, tearful confession, she had been unnervingly still, her gaze never leaving their faces. She hadn't interrupted, hadn't gasped, hadn't shown a single flicker of surprise. Now her voice cut through the silence, not with a shout, but with a chilling, surgical calm. It was the voice of a woman who had seen the bottom and was no longer afraid of anything. "So that's it," she said, her tone flat. "You gambled with your future and lost, and then you decided to gamble with your son's future to cover your tracks." My father flinched as if she'd struck him. He looked up, his eyes red and pleading. "Evelyn, please, we were desperate. We were going to lose everything, the house." "This house?" Grandma Evelyn swept a hand through the air, dismissing the vaulted ceilings and the expensive art on the walls. "This is just wood and drywall. It's an illusion you couldn't afford. You let your son eat ramen noodles and stress about his future so you could keep living in a lie." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "You watched him struggle. The simple statement hit me harder than any accusation of theft. You watched me struggle." They had listened to my worries about making rent, about my car breaking down, about the sheer weight of my student debt. They had nodded sympathetically and told me these things build character, all while cashing checks that had my name on them. Grandma Evelyn leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. This was it. This was the "and then it happened" moment. "You have two options, David, Sarah," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, which was somehow more terrifying than a scream. "And you will choose one of them before I leave this room. There is no negotiation." My mother finally looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Option 1, Grandma continued, her gaze locking onto my father. "I pick up my phone, I call the police, and I report you both for felony theft. I have the bank records, I have the dates, and I have your son as a witness. The district attorney will love this story. Pillar of the community steals college fund from his own son. You will lose this house anyway during the legal process. You will lose your reputations. You will likely go to jail. And you will never, ever see me or your grandson again." My father made a sound, a strangled, guttural sob that was ripped from somewhere deep inside him. It was the sound of a man watching his entire world being set on fire. "Or," Grandma said, her voice unwavering, "option 2. She turned to my mother. "You put this house on the market, not next month, not next week. On Monday morning, you will sell it for whatever you can get. From the proceeds, you will pay me back every last cent. That is $36,000. I will then give that money directly to Alex, as was always the intention. You will take what's left, move into a small apartment you can actually afford, and you will learn to live without the charade." She sat back in her chair. "Those are your choices. Go to prison and lose your son forever, or lose this house and begin to pay for what you've done. Choose." The room was utterly silent, except for my father's ragged breathing. My mother, who had been a statue of brittle pride, suddenly crumbled. Her face contorted, and she let out a single, heartbreaking sob. "Evelyn, wait," she choked out, a flood of tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. "Please." "There's nothing left to say, Sarah," Grandma said, her voice devoid of pity. "Yes, there is," my mother cried, her voice cracking. She looked from Grandma to me, her eyes a swirling mess of shame and desperation. It wasn't just the business deal, it wasn't just this house. I stared at her, confused. What else could there possibly be? She took a shaky breath, her hands twisting a napkin in her lap until it was a shredded mess. "A few years ago, I got sick," she whispered, the words barely audible. "It's a chronic condition. The doctors, the insurance, wouldn't cover the best treatments. They called them experimental. They said it wasn't medically necessary. But I was in so much pain. I couldn't function." She looked at me, her eyes begging me to understand. "We paid out of pocket for a while, using up all our savings, but it wasn't enough. The costs just kept piling up. I didn't want to tell you, Alex. I didn't want you to see me as weak, as a burden. I was so ashamed." Her confession landed in the center of the room like a grenade. The money wasn't just for the facade, for the nice cars and the big house. It was for her health. It was to stop her pain. The icy rage in my chest didn't vanish. It just shifted. It was still there, a hot, angry stone of betrayal. But now, tangled up with it was something new and profoundly confusing. It was pity. It was a wave of sorrow for my mother's secret suffering, for the pride and fear that had led her to make such a desperate, terrible choice. It didn't excuse anything. The lie was still a lie. The theft was still a theft. But the reason behind it was no longer simple greed. It was a tangled mess of fear, pride, and desperation. I looked at my mother not as a thief, but as a cornered animal. And for the first time that night, my anger was tainted with a profound, aching sadness. The 6 months that followed that Thanksgiving felt like a different lifetime. The world didn't stop, but the axis it spun on had been violently shifted. That perfect suburban house, the one I had grown up in, with its manicured lawn and oversized front door wreath that changed with the seasons, suddenly had a stark red and white "For Sale" sign hammered into its perfect grass. It was a wound on the face of the neighborhood, a public declaration of the failure my parents had fought so desperately to hide. I didn't go over to help them pack. I couldn't. I saw my mom once, from a distance, loading a box of what looked like old photo albums into the back of her SUV. Her shoulders were slumped, and the vibrant energy she always had, the one that organized neighborhood potlucks and chaired the PTA, was just gone. She looked smaller, older. My dad I didn't see at all. Our communication had withered into a series of stilted, barren text messages, each one an exercise in avoiding the truth. Mom, hope you're doing okay. Me, I'm fine. Dad, we moved into the new place. Here's the address if you need it. Me, okay. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment complex across town, the kind with beige siding and shared laundry facilities. My grandma told me they had started making the payments to her small wire transfers at the beginning of each month. They were doing what she demanded. The life they had built, the one propped up by my stolen future, was gone, and all I felt was a vast, hollow emptiness where my family used to be. The anger was still there, but it was a low, slow-burning fire now, banked by a layer of sorrow so thick I could barely breathe through it sometimes. My mother's confession about her health treatments hung in the air between us, an unresolvable complication. It didn't excuse what they did, but it explained the desperation, and knowing that felt like its own kind of burden. Then, one Tuesday morning, it happened. My phone buzzed with a notification from my banking app. It wasn't the usual low balance alert. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. The number I saw made the world go quiet. $36,000. Grandma Evelyn had kept her word. Seeing the money there, clean and real and all in one place, didn't feel like a lottery win. It felt like getting a cast taken off a broken bone. There was relief, a dizzying sense of lightness, but also the ache of a limb that hadn't been used in years and was just now learning to move again. I didn't go crazy. The Alex from a year ago might have dreamed of blowing it on a trip or a new gaming setup, but I wasn't that person anymore. The first thing I did was log into my student portal. I stared at the balance owed for my education, that terrifying number that had kept me awake more nights than I could count. I typed in an amount that made my hand shake and hit Submit Payment. A huge chunk of the weight I'd been carrying simply vanished. Next, I went after my freedom. The old, sputtering bus and late-night walks home from the coffee shop had defined my life. A week later, I stood on a used car lot and put a down payment on a 4-year-old Honda Civic. It wasn't fancy, it was gray and practical and had a tiny stain on the passenger seat, but it was mine. The first time I turned the key in the ignition and the AC blasted cool air in my face, I almost cried. 2 weeks after that, I handed in my notice at the barista job. The smell of burnt coffee and steamed milk would no longer be my permanent perfume. The car meant I could accept a paid internship in my field, environmental science, at a firm 20 miles outside of Austin. It was a real step toward a real career. With what was left, I finally secured my own place. A small one-bedroom off-campus apartment with a window that looked out onto an old oak tree instead of a brick wall. The first night there, I went to the grocery store and bought things I hadn't let myself buy in years. Chicken breasts, fresh broccoli, a bag of rice that wasn't the instant kind. I stood in my tiny kitchen chopping vegetables on a new cutting board, and the simple, rhythmic sound was the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. I was cooking a real meal for myself. The air filled with the scent of garlic and roasting chicken, and it smelled like hope. That Friday night, my laptop screen lit up with my grandmother's smiling face. She was sitting on her lanai in Florida, a glass of iced tea in her hand, the sunset painting the sky behind her in shades of orange and pink. "Well, look at you," she said, her eyes crinkling. "You look taller." I laughed, a real genuine laugh that came from my gut. "I feel taller, Grandma. I feel like I can finally stand up straight." We talked for over an hour about my new internship, the ridiculously loud squirrels in the oak tree outside my window, her weekly bridge game. The black hole of my parents' betrayal was still there, but for the first time, we could talk around it. We were building a new bridge over that chasm. Before we hung up, the laughter subsided, and I looked right at her image on my screen. "Grandma," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "thank you. And not just for the money. Thank you for being the one person who saw me, for believing me." Her smile was sad, but so full of love it felt like a physical warmth through the screen. "Oh, Alex," she said softly, "you are so easy to believe in. Now go on, get some rest. You've got a future to build." After the call ended, I walked over to my window and looked out at the quiet street. The sadness was still a part of me, a faint scar on my heart that would probably never fade completely. I had lost the parents I thought I had, and that grief was real. But as the first stars began to appear in the Texas sky, I took a deep breath of the cool night air and felt something else too. I was sadder, yes, and a whole lot wiser. But for the first time in a long, long time, I was standing on my own 2 feet, and I was free.